It is not every day that the internet delivers you a scandal that is an excuse to talk about Sabrina Carpenter, but today is that day. It also ties into why people got really upset when I talked about Maddie Pruitt Trout, a gorgeous white sister in Christ who is very wealthy, on this app, why I critiqued her politics and why there are people that are really upset with that. It all has to do with the presumption of innocence that is given to certain gorgeous, beautiful white women. Understanding that presumption of innocence is actually really useful for those of you who are going through communities and trying to live your best life, because when you need to be believed about something bad that is happening to you, or you need people to care about your pain, or even if you are a gorgeous white girly that wants to be a full complex human being and not be pigeonholed into the small controllable childlike doll, pay attention. Culture and history can work in your favor. So in case you missed it, there were parents who took their children, small children, to see the Sabrina Carpenter Sweet and Short and Sweet tour, which for those of us who are fashionistas, fabulous black women, people who just love costumes, drama, and glamour, we've been following along because we know Victoria's Secret has been dressing her. French lingerie houses have been dressing her for this show. It is a adult show. And if you listen to any of the music for more than 2 seconds, you will realize the girl is talking about adult activities as a grown woman. And part of why she has been able to thread this line between sweet and sexy, and why she's doing all this from the female gaze, is because she's been talking about her own pleasure and other women's pleasure, and the delight and some of the downfalls of navigating a world in which you as a woman are not necessarily treated well in a relationship. That's the theme, right? It's not for 7-year-olds. So anyways, people took their children to this show and then were scandalized and felt like their eyes were burned off. There was immediately a slew of black creators on Instagram who started talking about how it was very interesting that even though all the signs were there, from the marketing to the music to literally any piece of online information about this show, that this was a sexy adult show, that was all kind of filtered through this lens of a very petite, short, gorgeous white girl. She was, once again, in the long American tradition of media imagery, pigeonholed in this section of innocence because she's blonde and she's light-skinned and she is the person who would be considered the good person in the fairy tales. She is the person who we've all been conditioned to clock as innocent and normal and good, right? She would not be the evil witch in any story. We human beings are visual creatures, right? From the time we're small, red rose, black couch, that sort of thing, right? We see differences and then we make meaning out of them, right? Some of that meaning is true, some of that meaning is fake, some of those meanings help support our social biases or the ideas we have about who's better than whom, and some of those things are just differences that we celebrate, right? And something I've mentioned here before is that there is a specific type of woman in this country that is considered childlike, pure, and innocent until proven otherwise. Or she can get away with doing adult, raunchy sexual things for a long time and she could still be seen as clean and blameless. Whereas there is a presumption of ho-ness, sluttiness, trampiness with other women who look a little differently because, we could ask, okay, why? Why is that, Alex? That served a social class system for a long time. The ruling class of people who owned land had to basically pawn off their daughters in order to compete and participate in a social system in which you had more power and more protection depending on how much land you had. And women were valuable commodities because they could bear heirs to help you gain land, or they could be the ways in which a man could inherit more land, right? So you wanted your girls to be good girls, you wanted them to be pure, you wanted to make sure that they didn't have any random heirs running around, and you wanted to make sure that their wombs were only producing people for a certain kind of man that would broker a financial deal with you. Now, part of how many people in America became the ruling class or could remain in the ruling class is through wealth. And how do you get wealth? Well, sometimes you enslave other people and they do work for you for free and you get richer and richer and richer. And then there's other classes of people who you might not enslave or you might not indenture based on their skin color or their citizen status. And those people you might have sexual relationships with, but you wouldn't necessarily marry them because they weren't good enough to be part of the whole land owning power share. So what do you do to keep all this tightly in control? You make up stories about who's deserving and who's not, who's pure, who's not pure, who can be sexually abused and who cannot be sexually abused, who could be used and played with, and who has to be protected. And what do you know? Of course, due to the way the history, a bunch of factors, it ended up being that a certain kind of white woman was good, sexually pure, not deviant in any way. And then there were the women, the black women, the immigrant women, the native women, who, instead of just saying, oh, our men are abusing them, our men are using them, the story was, they can't help it. These women are sexual deviants. They are just going after these guys, and no one can do anything about it. In fact, these women want to be taken advantage of. That was a huge part of the story. If you have not read any history on this, you could read And They Were Her Property, and you can look into When and Where I Enter by Paula Giddings, who's a fantastic professor on gender, sexuality, and black women in America. Part of the reason, too, we had this whole idea about the innocent sexual white woman was because nobody wanted to truly believe that these white women would actually want sexual relationships with black men, or that these women, these pure good women that we have set aside, had any kind of sexual imagination or sexual world unto themselves. Because if you had to admit that the beautiful white girlies that were pure and protected in your group were also sexual human beings with agency, you might have to make sure that they were good. You might have to take care of them. You might have to respect them. So much of the evangelical theology that has come out of this American history is about making girls these sexually different creatures that are not at all like men. Very, very convenient. Now, the leftover residual beliefs that we have from this society are that certain kinds of women just they register in our head as more innocent, less sexual, and they have a greater leeway to do things and still be considered innocent than other kinds of women. So that is why you will see, when you go back into the imagery, the history of images in America, and you see all these over-sexualized little black girls, there was a reason for that. That was to cover up the abuse that was being done to them. That was also to set up in the minds of society the idea that these girls were set aside for that kind of abuse, and that's what they were made for. There's no point where they're actually innocent and they're little girls. They're always sexual vessels for American glory. Gosh, and the video keeps continuing, but this is also why people went to the Taylor Swift concert, and they were surprised that a 30-something-year-old woman would want to sing about her sexuality. They were shook. That's not the box she's supposed to be in. And this is why this ends up all being a trap, even for the very white girlies, the beautiful white girlies that are promised protection and respect if they stay in their little asexual boxes. This is nothing to say anything against asexual people. I'm talking about when a society of dominant people decide to incentivize someone being asexual or not having any kind of sexual imagination or life that is their own. That's not an actual identity or an expression of human sexuality. That is you being forced to behave or perform in a certain way in order to be accepted and to be safe. When we look at the work of Sheila Gregoire and all these other evangelical women that are trying to address the sexual abuse that is running rampant in American Christianity, we come back to this reality that the story we have told about women's sexuality and white women in particular is deeply damaging to everyone involved. It dehumanizes white women and it dehumanizes black women. Because so many of these girls, even when they are in their marriages, when they get with their good Christian guy, they're still treated like dolls. They're not people with whole sexualities unto themselves, or people who are both meeting and sharing in something mutually satisfying. Instead, it is a continued domination and a continued ownership that has accepted all this cultural baggage and just blessed it. Sabrina Carpenter is irritating to a lot of people because she is a woman in full possession of her sexuality. Even though, yes, we could talk about the hypersexualization and all that kind of stuff, I don't think that's exactly what's happening here.